the mighty and resilient Merrimack River, carving through the communities of our great region. My name is Linda Lorden, proud president of Merrimack County Savings Bank, and like the river that serves as our namesake, we're a constant yet ever-changing presence. Because to us, it's bigger than banking. It's about powering communities and putting people first. It's about knowing where you came from and where you're going. That's Merrimack style. Visit us at themerrimack.com.
History as it happens, July 15th, 2024. The madness of political violence.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time.
Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible?
The body of Senator Robert Kennedy is now in the air in a jet furnished by the White House.
That is the scene as the president emerged from the Washington Hilton Hotel.
Ronald Reagan was 2 months into his presidency when John Hinckley Jr. drew a $29 handgun.
Congressman Scalise was shot and nearly killed in 2017 by a gunman who opened fire as the Republican congressional baseball game.
Let's have trial by combat.
Violence has been part of American politics, both legitimate state violence and illegitimate vigilante justice, since the early days of the Republic. We have a tradition of assassinations, and now, after Donald Trump was nearly murdered, an opportunity to dial down the permanent state of crisis surrounding politics, campaigning, and commentary. That's next as we report History as it Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Well, it certainly seems in retrospect like there were a lot of things pushing in this direction, and this is what we grapple with as historians, right? The impossible looks inevitable after it happens, because you see the ways in which all of the rivers were flowing in the direction of the flood that no one expected until the flood breaks through the dam. What I will say as a historian is that the background, the sociology of this shooter should not be surprising to us. Many of the assassins or would-be assassins of presidents in our history have been individuals who, to put it in very stark terms, were pathetic.
That chart's a couple of months old, and if you want to...
We've seen the video 1,000 times by now. On live TV, Donald Trump grabbing for his right ear as gunfire rings out from a distance. The Secret Service tackling him as blood ran down his face. A frightening, sobering incident in the crucible of a presidential election year, an election viewed by many as critical to the future of American democracy. But this act of violence, committed by a 20-year-old man with a rifle whose politics are unknown, has, one hopes, put our petty differences into perspective. Of course, there's been finger-pointing. Some Republican elected officials and social media trolls are blaming Democrats and liberals for inciting the attack, because they've spent years comparing Trump to Hitler, saying Trump's an existential threat to American democracy. Trump's critics have countered that no one has done more to wreck basic civility and decency in politics than Trump himself. In an op-ed for Time magazine, historian Jeremy Suri says American society was formed from violence and it has remained violent ever since. From settlement to independence to nationhood, the United States has required force to build its institutions. Americans have always owned guns and used them to project strength and vigor. Think of the gunslinging cowboy or the gun-carrying lawman immortalized in Hollywood. Suri goes on to say guns have been central to our politics, including the settlement of native peoples' lands across the United States, the importation of slavery, a civil war, and the rise of America as a global superpower. Guns have influenced the politics of every era, from the death of Alexander Hamilton to the assassinations of Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr., among many others. The attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump, Suri says, was part of this long history. Understanding this can help us make sense of this horrific event and find a way forward. Indeed, this podcast episode and the one coming up on Thursday will deal with the causes and effects of political violence. And I'll share a link to Jeremy Suri's Time op-ed in my weekly newsletter. You can sign up at historyasithappens.com or search for History As It Happens on Substack. Now, I had planned to publish 2 episodes this week about open nominating conventions with historian Michael Kazin and George Washington's wisdom with historian Joseph Ellis, but the attempted assassination on Saturday forced me to change plans. I will publish those episodes next week. So, as you know, I've spent a lot of time on this show trying to convince everyone Donald Trump is not a fascist. He's not Hitler. Not because I thought such comparisons might incite someone to try to kill him, but because they're historically inaccurate. But as I prepared for this episode, it occurred to me, Adolf Hitler was nearly assassinated a bunch of times. The failed assassins often acted out of patriotism or the belief that Hitler was so dangerous, so beyond the pale, that murdering him was justified. Now, someone today who believes Trump is another Hitler, they might look at this history and say, the people who tried to assassinate the Fuhrer were on the right side of history. Bullets, not ballots. Any means necessary to stop someone like Adolf Hitler. Well, they may apply that same logic to Donald Trump today, again, if they really believe Trump's another Hitler. Just a thought as to why we should all drop the fascism and Nazism stuff. Jeremy Suri teaches history at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. He hosts This Is Democracy podcast and co-authors with his son Democracy of Hope on Substack. Jeremy Suri, welcome back to the podcast once more.
Nice to be with you, Martin, as always.
Well, I wasn't expecting to speak to you here on the Monday after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump on Saturday, but I had to shuffle my schedule around because of this breaking news, and really a tragic moment for our country. But I don't know about you, I've had trouble settling my mind and corralling my thoughts the past 48 hours or so.
Me too, for a variety of reasons. The one that really stands out to me of the long list of things that are unsettling and frightening about this moment, but the thing that stands out to me, we still don't have a grip on the ways in which the words and the partisanship and the anger of the last year or 2 years have encouraged people to do outrageous things. We do see versions of this on Twitter and elsewhere where people are saying things they never would say before, and that's become normalized. What worries me is that this kind of violence that we saw at the Trump rally, coming apparently from a registered Republican, that this kind of violence is becoming more normalized. And in our history, we've had moments where we've seen this violence more common.
And we're going to get into the history of this. You wrote an article for Time magazine that you also sent out on your Substack, Democracy of Hope. We'll get to the historical contexts in a moment. But yeah, part of the weirdness of this is we don't really know why this 20-year-old man, he's a boy in many respects, your brain is still developing, did this. His politics are mysterious or just simply unknown. As you mentioned, he may have been a registered Republican, and then he also gave a very small amount of money to a liberal group a couple of years ago. He was known as a kid in high school who was bullied, but we really don't know why he did this, other than the obvious. He had some type of grudge against Donald Trump, but we can't even know that for sure at this time. Yet my point here is it almost doesn't matter because of this climate in our country. The fact that this happened, the perceived motive has already been incorporated into larger narratives that, we're cascading towards violence because we're so divided. The rhetoric is so intense, it's so hot that something like this was inevitable.
Well, it certainly seems in retrospect like there were a lot of things pushing in this direction. And this is what we grapple with as historians, right? The impossible looks inevitable after it happens, because you see the ways in which all of the rivers were flowing in the direction of the flood that no one expected until the flood breaks through the dam. What I will say as a historian is that the background, the sociology of this shooter should not be surprising to us. And I write about this in the Time piece. Many of the assassins or would-be assassins of presidents in our history have been individuals who, to put it in very stark terms, were pathetic. Individuals who were dealing with challenges in their own lives, So it's not that politics and the violent climate around them had a one-to-one relationship with the actions that they took. It's more that the violence around them encouraged these troubled individuals to believe that they could somehow be actualized, somehow find glory, somehow find worth in acting in this violent way, that violence was going to give them value. And so it's not just that they wanted to kill a particular president, it's that they wanted to be made famous and seen as a real man for doing this.
People seeking meaning through violence. You can seek meaning by voting or not voting or going to a protest, but you can also seek it through violence. You know, this 20-year-old, Crooks was his last name, doesn't appear to have been part of a larger organization or political movement. He seemed to be acting on his own. But as you say, past assassins have done this. For instance, Lee Harvey Oswald. You mentioned Guiteau, the person who had delusions of grandeur when he assassinated, who was it again?
James Garfield.
James Garfield, 1881. And then Cholgos, who fired 2 bullets, reading from your article, into William McKinley in 1901. He was an anarchist, angered by inequalities of wealth. So, I don't know. I guess I'm trying to figure out, why does these personal motives, they do seem to, though, get incorporated into other narratives about, I guess, just the state of our country. Like something is cascading out of control.
Yes, and I think the moments when we see these assassination attempts, and they're often directed not just at presidents, but at other figures like a candidate, Huey Long in 1935, or George Wallace in 1972, or directed at prominent figures like a Malcolm X, or a Martin Luther King, or Robert Kennedy. These tend to occur in moments when there is more violence around and throughout our society. And the way I think we think about it as historians is that these figures are figures who, as you say, are searching for meaning, they're disgruntled, and violence in that moment has become the currency for that. And this is where what happened in Pennsylvania on Saturday is related to the mass shootings, is related to the stories of people like Dylan Roof and others, these troubled young men who seem to act out their troubles through violence because they are convinced from the world around them that the expression of violence helps to allay their problems, helps to be a prescription for dealing with their problems. And that's why the justification and the rhetoric which encourages violence is so dangerous.
In a society overloaded with guns that already has a gun violence problem, political violence has a shattering effect. I mean, I live in a city where there's a lot of violence, there are carjackings, there are shootings. It bothers me. It bothers the communities where the violence takes place. But it doesn't have the same type of rippling effect as something like this does. You know, the assassination almost of the soon-to-be Republican nominee in the middle of a presidential campaign leading up to an election that everyone agrees is really important. I mean, I think that goes without saying, although we always say every life matters. We know that we respond differently to different incidents that occur around us.
What happens when we see someone of that stature, someone prominent and famous, assassinated or nearly assassinated, it reminds us all of our mortality. Because if this can happen to him, it can happen to us. You know, this was the reaction throughout our society after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963. People went out and spent their savings because they said, what am I saving for? If this can happen to him, it can happen to us. So that's the part that really touches us personally. And then there's another element of this, which is it then lends itself to all kinds of conspiracies. And there's no evidence that in any of the presidential assassinations or assassination attempts in the U.S. there was any kind of conspiracy, except perhaps in the case of Lincoln, that John Wilkes Booth actually was running a conspiracy. But there wasn't a conspiracy in the sense that Oswald was part. There's no evidence that Oswald was part of some larger conspiracy, even though people are reminding me on Twitter that they still believe that stuff. But even though we kind of know that, it's hard not to think that. And it feeds a cynicism, it feeds disillusionment, and it feeds the worst of our thoughts.
Most people do not engage in violence. Most people do not want to kill or even think about killing a presidential candidate or someone they don't like. Yet, it doesn't take many people. It only takes one. Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, was nearly murdered. Someone was arrested near the home of Brett Kavanaugh. Here in the Washington, D.C. area, the Supreme Court Justice Steve Scalise was nearly shot to death at a softball game a few years ago. There was Gabby Gifford, and now this. So this is not anomalous. There are enough of these incidents that it is part of the fabric of American political reality. Am I overstating things?
No, and actually that's what I was writing about in the article you mentioned. Our politics have always been very violent. We tend to gloss over that because it's not pleasant to talk about. We like to talk about the high-minded ideals and the statesmanship, but not brass-knuckle, bullet-driven violence of our politics going back to Hamilton and Burr. It's there from the very beginning. We are a very, very violent society. We always have been, especially if you compare us to other societies. Now, why is it important to say that? Once you say it, it's fairly obvious. It's important to say it because I think it's incumbent, and in our best moments, which are most of our historical moments, not all, political leaders have been conscious of this, and they have done everything they can to tone down what they recognize is a dangerous tendency toward violence. If our tendency is toward violence, our leaders must, regardless of their politics, work to counteract that. Just as we fear a tendency to war in the international system, and we try to do on most days everything we can to reduce the likelihood of war, we should be reducing the likelihood of violence. And what I would say is that we're in a moment now when politicians have forgotten that, or they have intentionally gone in the opposite direction and leaned into the violence. And it has to be said, it really has to be said, that the Republican Party is not alone in its doing this, but it has really made violence the center of its political program in so many ways. And what do I mean by that? All I will say is that you just need to do a cursory search for what Republicans have been doing in the way they've been characterizing their efforts to unseat Democrats, whether you agree with them or not. And there is a violent association with that. For example, Republican state conferences where they put up dolls of Joe Biden and have people come and punch the dolls and slam the doll. That is encouraging violence. Or put up effigies of the sitting president. That's not normal. That has existed in other times in our history. Confederates did that about Lincoln. Many opponents of FDR did similar things. But that contributes to violence. That has to stop. We have to lean against that and call that sort of stuff out, even when it's done by the party we support.
And also, I mean, January 6th, the effort to exalt the January 6th rioters and call them warriors or hostages, that's been going on for months now. It happens at Donald Trump's rallies. They have a J6 prison choir where they do a mashup of was it the Star Spangled Banner, I think, and America the Beautiful, a couple of different patriotic songs, wrapping these people in a patriotic cloak.
The former president also describing his supporters who attacked the Capitol on that day, which left 5 people dead, this way.
They were there with love in their heart. That was an unbelievable, and it was a beautiful day.
One of the worst things leaders can do is glorify and valorize those who are violent actors. And we have to be very careful about this. This is, by the way, why Dwight Eisenhower was always uncomfortable with efforts to make soldiers in World War II into these superhero G.I. Joes. He wanted them to be seen as ordinary people who did their duty and then came home. There was a modesty that he believed was important. I think he learned that from the history of American military affairs. When, after the Civil War veterans, Confederate generals, especially those who were responsible for atrocities like Stonewall Jackson and others, were treated as heroes, we know that encouraged and justified violence. People, when they undertook to lynch communities, lynch individuals, they would cite and refer to the heroism of those Confederate figures. That is, in a sense, what is happening. I wrote about this in Civil War by Other Means. That is, in a sense, what's happening now when people valorize those who broke into the Capitol, killed police officers, attacked police officers, damaged the building, and tried to stop the orderly transition of power. That's equivalent, and that is encouraging and justifying this kind of violence, and political leaders should not tolerate that.
Yeah, the Klan and other like-minded people murdered blacks who wanted to vote, hold office after the Civil War with impunity. I mean, that is political violence. You mentioned your book about the Reconstruction period. I remember learning in Eric Foner's book, and I couldn't believe this, part of my ignorance at this stage of my life about our history. And when I read his book, Reconstruction, he said something like, in Texas one year, there are 100 murders, 100 lynchings of black people. Not one person was convicted of any crimes related to any of this. So
this is a direct effect of what we're talking about. It's not just that people were motivated to undertake this violence because they believed their heroes had done similar things. When they were prosecuted, as they should have been under the law, juries and judges believed that what they were doing, even though it broke the law, was justified because their heroes had done this. When you justify violence, you not only incentivize it, you give people a get-out-of-jail card. And the rule of law, which I hope everyone believes in this sense, I'm a conservative. I believe in the rule of law. The rule of law should clearly state that those who violently attack someone else have broken the law. The only case where violence is justified is self-defense, and that it has to be a self-defense against bodily harm to me, not self-defense of my views because I don't like your views.
A part of living in a modern state, a liberal democratic state, or maybe not, any type of modern state, is that the state is supposed to have a monopoly on violence, but we know in reference to the Klan and other periods of history, there has been paramilitary violence that's been given the blessing by state authorities.
And this is a major part of our history. It's part of the violence in our history that we don't study enough. The clearest example of what you're talking about is what you mentioned, the Ku Klux Klan, the Red Shirts in South Carolina, these various groups of local individuals, often local businessmen, local goons, police officers, sometimes sheriffs and judges, who put together their informal bands of men, usually carrying guns, who undertook justice in their own hands. Sometimes that meant finding and lynching an individual who had broken the rules, even if it wasn't illegal, who was trying to vote or trying to live in the wrong place or had looked at a white woman the wrong way. But sometimes it was even more informal than that. It was the threat of that, the intimidation. Those politics have not entirely gone away. The end of the 1960s and the Civil Rights Movement did not mean that went away. It's still very much alive in our society.
So you mentioned JFK before. Apparently, prior to his visit to Dallas in November of 1963, there was a lot of anti-JFK rhetoric. And I've been thinking a lot about this question. Where does one draw the line separating legitimate criticism of a public or political official in a democracy versus incitement to violence? So, for instance, some Republicans have said Democrats have spent the past 10 years calling Trump Hitler, that he's going to end democracy. So what do you expect people to do when they hear that, if this man wins another term, it's the end of democracy as we know it? Now, again, we don't know why this 20-year-old tried to murder Trump, whether it was because of that or some other reason. We may never know. Jeremy, I have been against calling Trump a fascist and a Hitler or whatever because I don't define fascism that way. I've done many, many episodes. I hope to never do one again about the definition of fascism with Roger Griffin and others. I've spoken to Ian Kershaw, genuine experts on interwar Europe, who say our problem today in the United States is not fascism and Nazism, etc. Trump is not Hitler. Where do you come down on this? What I think is almost hysterical or just misguided attempts to rummage around in the 1930s to understand the roots of Trumpism.
I tend to agree with your analysis, by the way, but I think there is actually a pretty clear line. It is perfectly fine to make an argument that someone's politics are beyond the pale. So some would argue, I would tend to agree with the argument that Donald Trump's politics go beyond the pale of what would make for the protection of a democracy. If we are a democracy, Donald Trump acts and advocates things which are unconstitutional, which run against what our democracy is. He's beyond the pale. That's a legitimate argument. Now, people on the other side can make, I would disagree with it, but it is a completely legitimate argument to say that Joe Biden is beyond the pale, that he's a socialist, and that he's taking away private property and supporting godless efforts to kill babies and things like that. Those are positions I would disagree with, but they are legitimate because they are claims about the nature of his politics and the nature of the positions he advocates. And even if they are claims that sometimes are without facts in one direction or the other, one has the right to make those claims. Where I would draw the line is when you go from a claim about someone's politics to justifying violence against them. Those are two different things. So you can say that Donald Trump or Joe Biden have no business being president and should never be president again. You can say that. Legitimate. But to say that we're going to blow them up or we're going to destroy them, we're going to kill him, that is advocating for violence.
The problem, though, is sometimes it's not that clear. So, for instance, some of Donald Trump's defenders, when they hear him say things like joking around about Paul Pelosi, or when he talked about Second Amendment remedies or whatever in respect to Hillary Clinton, they'll say, oh, it's just metaphor, or he's kidding around. Or more recently, when Joe Biden apparently told a private group that, stop telling me to leave the race, we need to put Donald Trump in our bullseye. I mean, some of this is metaphor or just typical political rhetoric, figures of speech. We need to target the other side, don't target me. To someone listening to that could be incitement to violence. To other people like you and me who are sane, we hear that and say, oh, that's just how, that's how politicians speak. But you might not find somebody saying flat out, we need to kill this person literally. They do it in different ways, right? And there's a gray area there. And we do have something called the First Amendment here. So incitement is very difficult to prove.
Yes, and that is a legal issue, but there's also the question of what we accept as legitimate political discourse or not. I'm not talking about going out and necessarily prosecuting people. But first, let's take it down from the presidential level. Here are a few things that I saw on social media that came directly from politicians. Marjorie Taylor Greene, congressperson from Georgia, who's a prominent figure in the Republican Party, has not been renounced by the party. She has an advertisement that ran yesterday that has her shooting what looks like an Uzi semi-automatic weapon or whatever at a vehicle that says Democrats and socialism, and blowing up the vehicle and saying we're going to blow up the Democrats and blow up Biden. That's incitement to violence. You've seen these ads. She actually shoots the weapon on the commercial, right? Ted Cruz has done similar things in his commercials in Texas. The Marjorie Taylor Greene one was the one I saw yesterday. I also saw video of a Republican candidate saying it's time to go out and kill some people. The video was taken before the assassination. So these things are being said, first of all.
Okay.
And so let's call out the obvious ones. Let's start there. Let's call out the obvious ones. Then you're right. Sometimes it is a gray area. But here's the thing. I do think it is incumbent upon politicians when they go into the gray area to make it clear that they don't mean that. And when there's a pattern of using this kind of rhetoric time and time again, and you are told that people see it as incitement, you have to make clear that you don't mean that. This is what all of us do, right? We might say something that offends someone else. We don't intend it. We don't just say, well, too bad for you. What we say is, no, what I meant was this. I did not mean to offend you, right? So let's make the extra effort. I'm okay with metaphors and jokes. That's the reality of our world. We need more humor now, by the way, in this moment, right? But let's go out of our way, as statesmen often do, as good teachers do, as good leaders do, to clarify our meaning. So if you say, well, let's put him in the bullseye, but I want to be clear, I'm not advocating violence. That's what we want. What Trump didn't do on January 6th, we can argue till the cows come home about whether his rhetoric incited violence or not that morning when he gave his speech at the Ellipse. Mm-hmm. But what he didn't do is he never, during that day, renounced the violence at the Capitol.
Well, he still hasn't conceded his loss.
Right.
And he's had many opportunities to say, the hang Mike Pence chance. He's had many opportunities to disown that, and he hasn't.
And so that is justifying the violence. He has, and I think that's intentional, and I can't see how we argue over that. Right. He's had the chance to renounce it. He hasn't. One
more point about the Hitler comparisons and why I think people should drop that, not only because it's just historically inaccurate. Adolf Hitler was nearly assassinated. Well, I forgot the number. Ian Kershaw has counted them all up. Something like 15, 16 times. It's actually amazing the SOB wasn't killed. How lucky he got. Well, remember the one in 1944 at his headquarters on the Eastern Front, Klaus von Stauffenberg?
Stauffenberg, yeah.
Does anyone read that and say, golly gee, it's too bad people resorted to political violence when they tried to get rid of Hitler? They should. No, we say it's too bad for history's sake that Hitler wasn't. Maybe I shouldn't put words and violent thoughts in people's heads, but you get my point. The German officers who tried to kill him thought they were acting in the best interest of their country. All right, so if you continue to compare somebody to Hitler, you don't have to be a genius or a historian to understand that a lot of people tried to kill Hitler because he was destroying Germany, which he was. See what I'm getting at? Why I think the Hitler comparison?
Yeah. No, I mean, obviously, we sympathize with those who take action to rid the world of horrible people, but that's one part of our brain. But we should all clearly state, and I clearly state, that it is never appropriate to support the killing of another human being because you have a political difference with them. That is just not acceptable. The difference in Hitler's case is only, it's not, I don't think it's justified to advocate assassination of Hitler within Germany in 1935, 1936, 1937. Where Stauffenberg becomes interesting, right, is because we were at war with Hitler at the time. He's a combatant. And so just as we are trying to kill the generals who are overseeing the war effort, that is a different thing. That is in a case of international warfare, which is why we might sympathize, just as why we might sympathize with the removal of Saddam Hussein from Iraq. But that's different from within your own politics. It is never, ever justified to advocate for the killing of someone within your own political system because you're on a different political side. I abhor that, and every human being should abhor that.
Hope I didn't sound like I was sanctioning assassinations or anything. I guess my point is, when you compare somebody to Hitler, other people can see that, well, Hitler has to be stopped by any means necessary. And again, we don't know why this 20-year-old kid did this.
I would just say a case of war, international war, is different from domestic politics.
We like to say that, and politicians say this all the time, violence has no place in our society. Well, they're right. We can't have this. And we maybe assume that everyone bristles or recoils at this. But we know in American history people have accepted violence. I was just using the example of Germany. In the late Weimar Republic, when Hitler was consolidating and seizing power, a lot of middle-class Germans were actually okay with all the paramilitary violence on the streets against communists and social democrats because they were tired of the chaos. They wanted law and order. After Lincoln's assassination, Jeremy, you've been writing about this. How did Southern newspapers react to that, and what did they say about John Wilkes Booth?
Yeah, it's similar to what we were just talking about. John Wilkes Booth was treated as a hero in the South. He saw himself that way too, right? When he slays Lincoln, he repeats Shakespeare's lines from Brutus and Julius Caesar. He was seeing that the words that were used quite often in Southern newspapers was that Booth had slayed the tyrant and saved us meaning Southerners, from a worse tyranny. And then there were all kinds of conspiracies, whether Lincoln was really dead or whether Booth was being framed. There's all this stuff. And why I think this is important is because I think once you go down that road, you start justifying all kinds of other violence. So if it's okay for Booth to assassinate Lincoln, then it might be okay for our militia to attack the Republican governor or Republican appointed judge. And you did see that happening. Actually, the targets of a lot of the violence in the South were people who supported the Union who were white. So that's the problem when you go down that road, because if you can assassinate one tyrant, why not assassinate all the rest of the tyrants?
Yeah, it's called the cycle of violence for a reason. Part of why it's hard to compare past eras to what's happening now is because no two eras are alike. The early 1960s, it was a different time. Kennedy's assassination was a watershed moment in American history. How did people respond to that? Were they able to come together for a short time in a way that a lot of observers don't think Americans are going to come together today?
Yes, and it's hard to recreate that moment because it is so different from our own. Yes, we've had another assassination attempt by a shooter, thankfully one not as diabolically accurate as the horrible Lee Harvey Oswald was. But it was a very different moment. Americans had lived through an inordinate amount of violence in World War II. This was a generation that knew violence actually more than we know violence ourselves, on a scale that most of us have not been in combat in that way, and those of us who have been in combat are in combat in very different circumstances. And there had been an assassination attempt against Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, in early 1933, but there had been that kind of violence was not the violence they had seen. They had seen organized violence of armies against armies. What Kennedy's assassination did is it shocked people, this generation had seen so much violence, that someone would do this, that you would have disorganized violence of this kind, that you would have vigilante lone shooter violence, and that someone as respected as a president, whether you liked him or not, would be the target of that. It shocked people.
Yeah,
I mean,
there's so little security around presidents in those days because it wasn't considered, I guess, all that possible that something like that can happen, right?
yeah, that's not how violence was expressed. Violence was expressed as a militia or military, not in that way. And you would kill a black man, maybe, but you wouldn't kill a president. And that's really what shocked people in the way that 9/11 shocked us. There had been plenty of airplane hijackings before, but this is not something we thought people would do, and do it in this way. And I think it had a huge effect. It did bring the country together for a while, and there's no doubt you've dealt with this in some of your other episodes. Lyndon Johnson masterfully used that moment to get the most far-reaching civil rights legislation since the Civil War, since the years after the Civil War, through Congress, bringing the country together, getting Republican votes for things that they would not have voted for otherwise. But it didn't last very long. Just as after 9/11, there was this short moment where we came together, and it didn't last for very long. I think we're in a moment now where, at least for a few days, people will be a little more careful. Most people, not all people, about saying the most violent-sounding things. Maybe the Republican convention will tone down the rhetoric a little bit, but that won't last very long. We'll go back to where we were in a few days.
Well, there is an opportunity here, and Donald Trump can take the lead to unify the country. Similar to when he got sick with COVID, he blew an opportunity there to bring the country together and learn from that. Lee Harvey Oswald, he ordered his rifle through the mail, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Guns are a common thread here, aren't they?
Well, and I think that's part of the story that's evolving before our eyes now. This 20-year-old, who, by the way, couldn't buy a beer in Pennsylvania, was able to acquire an AR-15. It appears he got it from his father, but he was able to go buy the ammunition, lots of it, and explosive material that morning, I think, from what I'm reading in the accounts. And there is a question of access. The earlier assassinations of presidents or assassination attempts usually occurred from a handgun in close range because it was difficult to get these kinds of weapons and difficult to move them around society. In a world now where AR-15s are more common, they're more commonly used. I mean, I just don't see any way around that analysis.
Well, Jeremy, we can start wrapping up with this, a difficult question to answer. I like to ask my guests questions that are impossible to answer, and that is, how is this, the attempted assassination of Donald Trump, going to affect the rest of the campaign? Maybe for some people it's too soon to start talking about things like politics. But, the Republican National Convention is getting underway today. Donald Trump will be there. He will be giving a major speech this week. So politics continues. And, in the past, for instance, when Ronald Reagan was nearly assassinated by John Hinckley, he received a lot of support. It's just a natural human reaction to lend somebody sympathy after they've been wounded, after they've been hurt, and to come together for a short time before you go back to being how you used to be, and maybe even work together for a short time. I guess we just don't know how all of this is going to play out in our modern, very divided world.
There is, I think, a good human tendency to sympathize with someone who's been injured and someone who's been nearly killed and someone who's been traumatized, as anyone would be in that situation. So there is some desire, I think, to sympathize with Donald Trump. I feel that. I'm not a supporter of his, but I feel that. I feel it's terrible that he came so close to losing his life in that setting. And so I sympathize with that. But it's what you do with it. How do you use that sympathy? How do you receive it? And how do you share it? I mean, the way to receive sympathy is to share sympathy with others. And this is what Ronald Reagan did so well. One of my favorite Reagan moments is one of the first speeches he gives weeks after leaving the hospital. He'd been in the hospital for quite a while. He read letters he received from children. And one child had written to him and said, Mr. President, I hope you won't have to give your speech in your pajamas. And he read that. And, I remember as a kid watching that, honestly, and it made us all feel connected because we've all had those moments as a kid when you don't feel well and you're in your pajamas and you don't want to go outside, right? And so what Trump needs to do is to show a softer, more empathetic side. It's an opportunity, but it's an opportunity for Biden if Trump isn't able to do that. And I'm going to say something now that runs against what a lot of others are saying. I think the standing on stage and raising your fist after you've been shot is not the way to evoke sympathy. It's the way to look like a tough guy. And that's Trump's natural inclination. I grew up in New York. That's my natural inclination, too. But I'm not sure that's the way you turn this into an advantage. You turn this into an advantage as being the person who's going to bring stability. All of us, Democrats and Republicans, want this violence to end. We don't want more. No one wants more of it. Who's going to be the candidate that makes the credible case that they're going to make sure we have less violence, not more? If I'm advising either candidate, that's the position I'm trying to push them toward. And my prediction is that the arguments against violence for stability, for rationality, for safety, that those are going to become more important in this campaign. Biden was trying to make the case that he, as president, is doing that in the speech he gave on Sunday evening. Let's see if Trump is able to make the case for that.
Well, it's always hard to predict the future. And as soon as this happened, really, as soon as it happened, you start seeing people posting on social media, that's it, Trump's got it in the bag. Part of that is, well, how can Biden attack the guy now as he's been attacking him as a threat to democracy when the poor guy's just been shot in the head and the bullet grazed his ear? And Biden, of course, is putting his campaign on hold here. But you know what? There's another side to this. Our news cycle, such as it is, moves so quickly, and we move on from stories so quickly. Is it possible that we even move on from this, an attempted assassination of the most influential Republican politician in the country, quickly? I don't know. It's hard to say.
I think we will, because there's just such a cacophony, an avalanche of things happening. And again, it's what people do. You brought up the point about Trump having COVID. He got a little sympathy, but then he lost that because he moved on, too. So it does depend what the candidates do. Do they keep it in the news or not? Does their other behavior reinforce the way we remember this in one way, sympathetically, or not, in a way that's more about the violence?
And I got to say, it's still a little uncomfortable, although we have to do it, even talking about this type of horse race stuff after someone's almost been killed. But
I agree.
I mean, a convention is going on today, and I guess maybe in a sense it's healthy for our country not to dwell on it. We do have to attend to business.
Yeah, but we can't just go back to where we were. We have to actually think about this. I hope. I tend to be an optimist. I'm cautiously optimistic. I hope some people, not all people, but some people will think twice about saying things in the heat of the moment that encourage violence. That did happen after Steve Scalise's, after he was shot. For a few weeks and few months, congressional rhetoric was a little more careful. Members of Congress were. I mean, it was at the congressional baseball game. It could have been any of them, right? And so maybe there'll be a little more care by some people. Let's see. Let's see how the Republicans depict themselves and what speeches they give in the next few days.
Yeah, I mean, Scalise was targeted for political reasons. The person who shot him didn't like his politics. You said we shouldn't have people inciting violence. Agreed. We talked earlier about how sometimes it's not easy to say what is actual incitement to violence. How about just less division? Less division. There's legitimate criticism of your opponents, but then there's comments that are meant to deliberately divide and cause, well, people to live, as we've discussed before, in different universes, different competing media ecosystems where they have no respect at all for the other. And we're living in a 24/7 existential crisis mood. And people who watch cable news on either side of the aisle, I mean, they're afflicted by this mindset. Everything their opponent does is some type of existential blow to our society as we know it. I can't wait to be in Harper's Ferry in a few days, walking around in the woods without any screens around, listening to birds and crickets.
Yeah, it's a beautiful place. I'm glad you're going. I agree.
Of course, there was an act of political violence in 1850.
I was just going to say, the irony is, of course, that's the site of John Brown's raid. But look, the opportunity Biden has is that a lot of people we know this from all kinds of polling, a lot of people are so tired and so exhausted with what you just described so accurately, Martin. And if he can offer an anchor of stability, if he can offer some anchor of rationality way out of this, that will be attractive to people, but he has to articulate that. And the opportunity for Trump, I can't imagine him becoming any kind of really great unifying figure, but if he can show he cares about that and wants to move in that direction, that can be advantageous to him. One of the biggest threats Reagan had and others like him as Republicans running for re-election is that people thought they were unhinged. Reagan made a conscious effort in '84 to tone down his rhetoric. Do we see that now out of Trump or not? I don't know.
I want to speak to you tonight about the need for us to lower the temperature in our politics and to remember, while we may disagree, we are not enemies. We're neighbors. We're friends, co-workers, citizens, and most importantly, we're fellow Americans. We must stand together. Yesterday's shooting at Donald Trump's rally in Pennsylvania calls on all of us to take a step back, take stock of where we are, how we go forward from here. Thankfully, Former Trump is not seriously injured. I spoke with him last night. I'm grateful. He's doing well, and Jill and I keep him and his family in our prayers. We also extend our deepest condolences to the family of the victims who was killed. Corey was a husband, a father, a volunteer firefighter, a hero, sheltering his family from those bullets. We should all hold his family and all those injured in our prayers. Earlier today, I spoke about an ongoing investigation. We do not know the motive of the shooter yet. We don't know his opinions or affiliations. We don't know whether he had help or support or if he communicated with anyone else. Law enforcement professionals, as I speak, are investigating those questions. Tonight, I want to speak to what we do know. A former president was shot, an American citizen killed, while simply exercising his freedom to support the candidate of his choosing.
On the next episode of History as It Happens, we'll stay with the issue of political violence. We'll be joined by historian Roger Griffin, who's been on the podcast many times, an expert on fascism, socio-political movements, terrorism. We will delve into the causes and effects of political violence in society. That is next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.